His 6-year-old drawings predicted me before I even existed, and now I could not look away. I remember the first time I saw him. It was in the quiet corner of a small art studio in the city, the kind of place that smells like paint and old wood. He looked down at a sketchbook and then up at me, and I felt a jolt. I do not know why. Maybe it was the soft brown of his eyes or the gentle tilt of his head, but something in me stilled, as if a part of me had been waiting a long time for this moment. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Hi." I said hi too, but my voice sounded smaller than usual. Then he hesitated before saying, "I found these drawings from when I was 6, and there is a girl in all of them, and she looks exactly like you." My heart skipped a beat. My fingers tightened around my bag strap. Because how could that be possible? I did not answer immediately. I just stared at the sketchbook, the pages full of childlike lines and colors. Yet the girl's face in every sketch had my eyes, my smile, the curve of my chin. I blinked once, twice, trying to convince myself it was coincidence, but every page pulled me in deeper. He flipped a page slowly, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile, and I noticed the way his hand shook a little, the way his voice softened. He said, "I have never seen anyone like her except in my imagination." I swallowed and whispered softly that it is strange to see yourself imagined before you existed. He nodded slowly, as if he had been thinking about that for a long time. I took a small step closer. The paper smelled faintly of old pencil and crayons, and something in the air felt electric, like the world had paused to let us notice the impossible. He looked up at me again and said, "Do you believe in fate?" I did not answer right away because I did not know if I believed. But looking at those sketches and at him and feeling the odd pull in my chest, I wanted to believe. I nodded just a little and said, "Maybe I do." He smiled softly like he had been waiting for that. And then we just looked at the pages together, the quiet hum of the studio around us fading into something else, like we had crossed time itself to meet in this fragile, soft moment. Have you ever seen someone who looks familiar but you never met? After that first quiet moment, I could not stop thinking about him or the drawings. The girl in the sketches was like a reflection of me from some strange mirror. In another time, I kept imagining him as a little boy hunched over paper, his tiny fingers gripping crayons, his tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth in concentration, and somehow that little boy had drawn me before I even existed. It was impossible, yet the resemblance was uncanny. I asked him how he remembered those drawings. He shrugged and said he had found them while cleaning his attic, and something compelled him to bring them here to the studio and show someone. I laughed softly because I wanted to believe fate or magic or some invisible hand had guided him to me. He laughed too lightly, almost nervously, and said, "Maybe it is coincidence," but I felt it in my chest, a quiet certainty that it was not. He began to tell me stories about the sketches, about the way he would sit for hours drawing little scenes from his imagination, and how the girl appeared in all of them, almost like a muse. He said he had never known who she was or why she appeared. Yet every time he drew her, he felt a strange sense of peace, and now seeing me, he wondered if perhaps she had been waiting to be found too. I did not know what to say, because the idea of being someone's imagined presence before birth felt surreal, yet comforting. It was like someone had written my story in secret, and I had just discovered it now. As he spoke, his words seemed to hang in the air, soft, gentle, deliberate. I noticed the way he looked at me, not like a stranger, but like someone who had known me through time and paper and imagination, and that made my chest tighten in a way that was unfamiliar yet not unwelcome. We sat on a worn leather couch, the sketchbook open between us, tracing lines with our eyes and our fingers without touching, and I realized I could spend hours like this, just looking and listening. The quiet rhythm of shared stories between a girl and a boy who had once been separated by years yet connected by lines of pencil. He asked me what I thought about the girl in the drawings. I told him she felt familiar, almost like she had been waiting to be recognized. She looked like someone who had always been in the corner of his mind, and now she was finally here in real life, smiling nervously at him across a small art studio. I could see the relief in his face, as if he had been holding a secret and finally shared it with someone who understood the gravity and beauty of the impossible. I did not know what to say next, so I just nodded softly and said, "She is beautiful." And he smiled almost shyly, like he had been hoping for that acknowledgement, and that simple exchange felt monumental. We began talking about other things, slowly at first, the kinds of books we liked, the smells that made us nostalgic little things from our childhoods, and yet every conversation returned gently to the drawings, and to the girl who had been imagined and now somehow existed. She had bridged time between us in the most inexplicable way. I realized then that meeting him was not just chance, but the continuation of something that had started years ago in the soft scratches of a pencil on paper, and that idea both thrilled and terrified me. Would you believe it was fate or coincidence? After that first meeting, I could not stop thinking about him or the sketches. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the little girl in crayon lines running across imaginary fields or sitting by a tiny drawn pond. She had my eyes, my smile, my tiny gestures, as if someone had caught me before I even knew I existed. It made me shiver softly and wonder if imagination could really predict real life. He sent me a message the next day, asking if I'd thought more about the drawings. I replied almost immediately, yes, and I cannot stop thinking about how she looks like me. He wrote back a small laughing emoji and said, "I know it is strange, but it feels like a message from somewhere beyond," and I nodded. Even though he could not see me, we started meeting more often at that small studio, talking about life and art and the way certain images or memories linger without explanation. He told me about the little sketches he had hidden under his bed, the ones he was too shy to show anyone, and I asked if he had ever imagined me as real before. Now he laughed softly and said he did not know what to think until he saw me and realized perhaps she had always been there in some form. The thought of being part of someone's imagination before I existed made me feel delicate and important, like a secret the universe had been keeping, and now I had been entrusted with it. Sometimes we would sit quietly flipping through the sketches, tracing the lines together, imagining the little stories behind each one. A tiny girl chasing butterflies, a girl picking flowers, a girl reading under a tree. He said that when he drew her, he felt comforted, and I realized he had been seeking something familiar even without knowing it, and that familiarity now included me. It was strange how time folded in on itself to bring us here. how months or years or decades could collapse into a single moment of recognition. I told him he had a gift that could see before it happened, and he blushed slightly. I did not say it aloud, but I thought, maybe I was part of that gift too. We talked about our childhoods, our fears, our small obsessions. He said he had always loved drawing because it allowed him to create safe worlds, worlds where he could explore feelings he did not yet understand, and now he could see that the little girl had been a vessel for all of that, a silent witness, a quiet companion who became real. The idea of growing up with someone unknowingly imagining me before I existed made my chest tighten. I felt a strange mix of wonder and disbelief, and I could not help but lean closer as we discussed what it might mean. Sometimes I would catch him staring at me softly when he thought I was not noticing, as if he was seeing both me and the girl in the sketches at the same time, and that made me feel almost weightless, like I was part of a story that stretched across time, a line of art and life intertwined. I laughed quietly at the thought, and he smiled and asked what was funny. I said nothing, just marveling at the strangeness of being imagined before existing. He nodded, as if he understood completely, and I felt like in that tiny studio we had entered a place outside of time, a place where imagination and reality met and whispered softly into each other's lives. Do you think memories can cross time in strange ways? Over the next few weeks, I felt a pull toward him that I could not explain each meeting. Each glance, each soft word seemed to connect me not only to him but to the little girl in his sketches. It was like tracing a path someone had drawn long ago and finally stepping onto it. We would sit at a small table in the studio, tracing lines of pencil and crayons. I would point at a tiny detail, and he would smile, saying, "Yes, that is exactly what she would do." And somehow, it felt like he was describing me without knowing it. The feeling was both thrilling and terrifying. At the same time, he began sharing more of his childhood drawings, stories I'd never heard, the little sketches tucked in old boxes in dusty corners of his room, the ones he drew when he was sad or lonely, the ones where the little girl appeared in moments of quiet magic and innocence. I asked him if he remembered why he drew her. He shook his head softly and said, "I think she was a comfort, a friend before I had friends, before I had anyone to understand me." And I realized that somehow that little imagined girl had carried him through all those years, and now she was here in front of him in a way that could not be mistaken. We spent hours imagining the stories behind each drawing, sometimes adding little ideas of our own. I suggested what the girl might be thinking or feeling. He nodded and added more. We laughed at the coincidences, the way her tiny gestures matched mine in subtle ways, even the tilt of the head, the curl of the hair. It was uncanny, and I wondered how the universe could orchestrate something so precise and delicate. We were building a shared memory across time, one that had begun long before we had met in person. One day he asked me if I had ever imagined myself in his world as a little girl. I laughed softly and said, "No, I never thought anyone could have imagined me before I existed." He looked at me with that soft, careful gaze that made me feel seen, in a way I'd never been, and whispered, maybe she was waiting to be recognized. And I felt a shiver of something tender run through my chest, like the quiet realization of destiny finally touching us. We did not speak for a moment, just looked at each other, and the sketches on the table, and the soft sunlight falling across the pages. Sometimes I caught him staring at me as if he were seeing both me and the little girl in his drawings at the same time, and that made my heart flutter with an impossible excitement. It was like existing in two timelines at once, the child of imagination and the woman in front of him. And I realized that somehow I had become part of a story that had been written years ago, quietly, patiently, and now was unfolding in real time. It was delicate and fragile and beautiful. He told me that before he met me, he had always felt a sense of longing when he drew the little girl, like something was missing. And now that longing was gone, it had been replaced by something real, something tangible and warm. And I nodded, because I felt the same. My chest soft and heavy with the realization that the girl he had imagined and the girl I was had finally collided in the quietest, most perfect way. Have you ever felt déjà vu about someone new? One afternoon, he asked me to come with him to his old attic. He said he wanted to show me something he had never shared with anyone else. I followed quietly, the staircase creaking softly under my feet, and the air smelled like dust and old paper. He opened a large wooden chest and pulled out boxes stacked with yellowed papers and worn notebooks. I felt a flutter in my chest as he lifted the lid, revealing hundreds of sketches, some folded carefully, some smudged with time. He gestured for me to look. I knelt beside him and carefully opened the first notebook. The pages were full. Of the little girl, I recognized her immediately, the hair, the eyes, the expressions, the tiny gestures, and I realized she had been with him through every moment of childhood joy, sadness, imagination, and play. He turned to me nervously and whispered, "I never thought anyone would see all of this." I swallowed and said softly, "I am honored to see it." He smiled faintly and said, "It feels strange to share her, and yet here you are looking at her," and I nodded. I understood the weight of that statement. It was not just drawings, it was a history, a quiet record of feelings and emotions only a child could capture, and somehow those drawings had anticipated me in ways I could not explain. I ran my fingers lightly over one of the sketches and felt a shiver, as if touching a thread that connected past and present. He showed me page after page, each one telling a story without words. The little girl chasing butterflies in a garden, she had imagined a small treehouse tucked in branches she had never climbed yet. She was there. The sketches were imperfect but full of life, full of intention and tenderness. I realized he had spent hours giving life to someone he had not yet met, someone who now existed in front of him, and it was surreal, beautiful, and deeply emotional. At the same time, I asked him softly if he remembered drawing her for the first time. He shook his head slowly but said, "I know I wanted her to exist even when I did not know who she was." I smiled softly because I felt the same, wanting to exist in someone's imagination before they even knew it was possible, wanting to leave a mark on a world that would recognize you years later. He looked at me and whispered, "I feel like she was waiting for you." And I nodded, unable to find words that could capture the strange swell of emotion rising in my chest. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the boxes, talking quietly about each drawing, imagining the stories behind them, laughing softly at the coincidences, the gestures, the expressions, the uncanny resemblance. I realized then that our meeting had not been chance, that these sketches were a bridge, a thread connecting two lives across years and experiences, and now we were walking that thread together cautiously, tenderly, yet with growing confidence and warmth. As we closed the last notebook and stacked the boxes carefully, he turned to me and said softly, "I cannot believe you are here, seeing this with me." I smiled quietly and whispered, "I cannot believe it either." And in that silence, we shared a soft connection, an understanding that the little girl in the drawings and the woman standing before him had finally found each other across time, imagination, and reality. Would you confront someone or stay silent if they imagined you before you existed? After the attic visit, I felt a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. Every time I thought about him and the little girl in his sketches, it was like living in a story written long before I existed, yet unfolding perfectly in real life. I started noticing small gestures between us, the way he would glance at me softly when he thought I was not noticing, the quiet way he would mimic little expressions from the drawings as if unconsciously remembering the child he had once imagined. I realized that our connection had grown deeper than I could explain. It was like stepping into someone else's memory and finding a piece of yourself already waiting. We began spending more time together outside the studio, walking through quiet streets holding small coffees in our hands. I noticed he sometimes carried a sketchbook, just in case the little girl needed to appear again. And I teased him gently about being so protective of someone who had been drawn decades ago. He laughed softly and said, "She is still part of me, still part of my imagination." And I nodded, because I understood that feeling, that certain pieces of your past never really leave you. They just wait quietly to be recognized or remembered. One day he asked me to close my eyes while he sketched something. Quickly he said it would only take a few minutes. I watched him intently as he moved the pencil over paper with soft, sure movements, the little lines forming the shape of a girl running across a meadow. When he handed me the page, I opened my eyes and gasped softly. It was her, the little girl in his sketches, except somehow she had aged slightly, like she had stepped forward from the past into a version of now. I felt my chest tighten as I realized he had not only drawn me once before I existed, but now he had captured the essence of me in real time. It was breathtaking. We talked softly about what it meant to have someone imagined before they existed. He said it felt like a thread had always connected us across years. I told him it felt like being part of a secret story, only we could read. And he nodded quietly. We laughed softly at the strangeness of it and then fell into silence, feeling the weight of time and imagination and reality folding into one delicate space. It was magical, terrifying, beautiful, and completely surreal. Sometimes I would catch him staring at me thoughtfully, as if he were comparing the woman before him to the little girl he had drawn, and I realized he was seeing both timelines at once, the child of imagination and the person she had become in the present, and I felt honored and almost sacred to occupy that space to be remembered before I existed and recognized now. At the same time, it made my heart flutter and ache softly. At night, I would replay the attic visit and the sketches in my mind, imagining him as a little boy, imagining me as a little girl, and then imagining us here together finally. And it was impossible to separate the years from the present moment. Every glance, every smile, every soft gesture felt layered with history and imagination, and that made our connection feel almost predestined. I realized then that some stories begin long before we are ready to recognize them. How would you react if someone recognized you from their past imagination? As the days passed, I found myself drawn to him in ways that felt inevitable, almost like a current pulling me gently towards something I could not yet name. We began spending more time together outside the studio, walking slowly along quiet streets, watching the way sunlight hit buildings and cars and trees. He would point out small details with a soft smile, and I would laugh quietly sometimes, because he noticed things I had never seen before. Sometimes because it reminded me of the little girl in the sketches who had always been paying attention, even when no one else had. He started bringing new sketchbooks with him wherever we went. I noticed the little lines of pencil appearing softly in cafes, on park benches, and quiet corners of libraries. He would sketch small, fleeting moments, and I realized he was capturing not only me, but us. The way the light fell across my hair, the way I tilted my head when I was thinking. He said softly that he wanted to remember everything about this moment. About me, about us. I felt my chest tighten as I realized how tender and deliberate his attention was. It was love forming quietly in lines and gestures and silences. One evening, we sat by a fountain in the park, the water glimmering in the soft evening light. He opened his sketchbook and handed me a page. It was the little girl again, but this time she was holding hands with a boy, and both were smiling toward a future only they could imagine. I looked at him and said softly, "Is that us?" He nodded with a quiet smile. "Yes, it has to be us." And I realized then that our story was no longer just a coincidence or a strange twist of fate. It was becoming a living, unfolding thing, a life threaded through imagination, past and present. Sometimes he would pause in mid-sketch and look at me, as if he were seeing both the little girl and the woman she had become. At the same time, the past and present colliding in soft lines of pencil. It made me feel weightless and grounded at the same time, like I was both a memory and reality, and it was a feeling I wanted to linger in forever. I smiled softly at him, and he smiled back, and in that moment, everything felt like it had been waiting for us to notice it. We talked about the sketches, about childhood, about the strange ways imagination sometimes predicts reality. He admitted quietly that he had always wondered if the little girl had been waiting for someone to notice her in the world, and I whispered, maybe she was waiting for me. He reached out and gently took my hand, our fingers entwining, and I felt an electric thrill that seemed to cross years, decades, and imagination all at once. It was impossible yet undeniable that night. I lay in bed thinking about the little girl and the man who had drawn her, and about me who had become her. I realized our story was not just about coincidence or chance. It was about recognition, about seeing someone who had been imagined long before they existed, and finally meeting them in the present. And it was beautiful and terrifying and perfect, and I knew in my chest that our connection was something rare, fragile, and eternal in ways words could barely capture. Do you think imagination can predict real life? Weeks passed and our connection deepened in quiet ways. The little sketches had become a bridge between us, a reminder of how long this story had been waiting to unfold. Sometimes I would watch him draw and imagine him as a little boy, hunched over paper, his tiny fingers moving carefully over crayons, his eyes intent and curious. And I realized that those moments had shaped the man in front of me, the one who now watched me with soft, careful eyes, full of warmth and wonder. He began sharing more about his childhood memories, the way he would hide the sketches under his bed, the times he drew the little girl to comfort himself when he was lonely or scared. I listened quietly, feeling both awe and tenderness at the devotion he had given to someone who did not yet exist in the world. And yet now, here I was. She had become real and tangible, and he looked at me the same way he had always looked at her in those sketches. And I felt honored and almost sacred in that gaze. One day he suggested we draw together. I laughed softly, unsure if I could capture anything worthy of the little girl, but he insisted we try. He handed me a pencil and a blank page, and I began sketching slowly the lines, imperfect yet alive. Each stroke a tentative connection to him, to the child he had been, to the girl he had imagined. I watched him beside me, moving confidently over paper tracing shapes. With soft precision, I felt a quiet thrill, as if we were both stitching a tapestry of past and present together. He paused mid-sketch and looked at me, his eyes soft and thoughtful. He whispered, "I never thought I would meet her like this." And I felt a shiver of recognition in my chest. I told him maybe we were both waiting for this moment, and he nodded slowly as if agreeing with the truth. We could not yet speak aloud. The sketches before us became more than paper and pencil. They became a story of time folded in on itself. A story that had waited years for recognition and was now breathing softly in our hands. Sometimes I would notice him glancing at me when he thought I was not seeing, and I realized he was seeing both me and the little girl in the sketches. At the same time, the child of imagination and the woman in the present, colliding softly in his mind, and that made my chest lift and ache all at once. It was impossible to describe the wonder of being recognized before I existed and acknowledged. Now, it was a fragile gift we held between us. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the sketches, the little girl and the boy who had drawn her, and the woman who now existed in real life. I realized that our story was not just coincidence or chance. It was recognition and timing and imagination colliding. It was beautiful and delicate and rare. And I knew with a quiet certainty that our connection was something beyond words and that somehow the little girl had led us here, waiting patiently across time. Have you ever felt an instant deep connection with someone? As our days together continued, I realized that every interaction, every smile, every quiet conversation carried layers of history and imagination. The little girl in his sketches had not only predicted me, but had softened the way we connected in the present. He would reach for my hand sometimes without thinking, tracing small lines in the air as if he were drawing her gestures onto me, and I would feel a thrill ripple softly through my chest. It was tender and delicate, but it held a weight of meaning that felt almost eternal. We began taking walks through quiet streets holding sketchbooks in our hands, sometimes drawing together on park benches or in the corner of a small cafe. He would glance at me softly and whisper quietly about the little girl, and I would nod, feeling the wonder of how imagination and reality intertwined our worlds in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. Sometimes he would stop mid-step and say softly, "I cannot believe this is real," and I would smile because I felt the same. It was impossible yet undeniable. A story written decades ago in crayons and pencils, finally meeting the present moment in living, breathing form. He told me about his dreams as a child, how he imagined worlds where the little girl would play, where she would run and laugh and feel safe. And I realized that those sketches had been more than imagination. They had been preparation. They had shaped the way he would approach life and love, and now I was part of that tapestry, the real-life girl, stepping into the path he had unknowingly drawn for us years ago, and it was overwhelming to feel so central to someone's imagination before even existing. Sometimes at night, we would sit quietly together, tracing lines in sketchbooks, talking softly about what the little girl would do next or where she would go, and it was like living in a story. Across time, the past and present folding gently around us, the sketches became a map of our emotions and connection, a silent witness to the way fate or imagination or some invisible hand had guided us to each other. I would glance at him and see both the boy and the man in one gaze, and it made my chest ache with wonder. One evening he paused and looked at me seriously, his eyes soft and deep, and said, "I never thought I would meet her like this," and I felt a shiver run through me. I whispered, "Maybe we were always meant to find each other," and he smiled faintly. The little girl in his sketches had been waiting for recognition, and now the woman before him was acknowledging that connection. We held hands and walked slowly into the fading light. Feeling time collapse around us, the sketches past and present, converging in quiet, beautiful ways. I realized then that our story was not about chance. It was about recognition, imagination, timing, and connection. It was delicate, rare, and beautiful, and I felt a quiet certainty that the little girl and the man and the woman now standing here had always been threads of the same story, softly woven across years waiting to be acknowledged. Would you let destiny guide you or ignore it? The day we finally talked about what it all meant, I realized how much our lives had been shaped quietly by imagination and timing. We sat in the studio surrounded by sketches, the little girl watching us from every page, and I felt a strange warmth, like someone was smiling softly across time. He took my hand in both of his and said softly, "I cannot believe you are here after all these years," and I felt my chest swell with something tender and profound. I whispered, "Maybe we were always meant to find each other," and he nodded. He told me that seeing me in person for the first time had been like meeting a memory, a dream he did not know existed until it became real. And I smiled softly because I'd felt the same. The way our eyes met, the subtle gestures, the shared silences, everything carried a weight of recognition, of a story begun long before either of us understood it. The little girl in his drawings had been a bridge, a thread connecting past imagination to present reality, and now that thread was alive and tangible between us. We laughed softly, remembering how uncanny the sketches were, how the little girl had my expressions, the tilt of my head, the small gestures I had never noticed in myself until he pointed them out. Gently and carefully, each line of pencil had been imbued with intention, care, and something almost magical. And now it felt like those small lines had guided us to this exact moment to meet each other and understand what had been quietly waiting all along. Sometimes he would pause while sketching and look at me as if seeing both timelines at once. The boy who imagined the girl and the woman who had become her and I felt a shiver of awe at being part of someone's imagination before I existed, and recognized now in the present it was delicate and surreal, yet entirely real. The sketches were no longer just paper and pencil. They were living evidence of a connection that transcended years that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. We walked slowly through the city streets holding sketchbooks together. The evening sun casting long, soft shadows around us, he whispered softly that he never imagined a little girl he drew would become someone he could love in reality, and I smiled softly, feeling the same. It was like fate or magic, or some invisible hand had guided our lives through decades of quiet longing and imagination to collide here now in soft, perfect timing. As we sat by the fountain watching the water ripple, we held hands and looked at each other, and I realized that some stories are written long before we are ready to understand them, that some connections exist across imagination and reality and time itself, and that meeting him, the boy who had drawn me as a little girl, and becoming part of his story was the most surreal, beautiful, and tender experience I had ever known. The little girl in the sketches had waited patiently across years, decades, and imagination, and now the woman before him was here, acknowledging the story finally, and I knew that our connection was fragile, rare, timeless, and deeply perfect in ways words could not capture. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Written together in real life, did this story make you believe in signs from the past?